Emily knocked on her neighbor's door, and when Sarah opened it, she stared at her classmate in surprise. "Do you have anything to eat?" Emily asked as she stepped inside. "Yes, come in," Sarah offered. They sat at the table, which served as both a lunch and writing space, while Emily began eating pasta and sharing details about her unsuccessful date. Emily was a beautiful girl, and there were always guys eager to meet her and spend time together. However, her dreams extended beyond that. She envisioned fancy restaurants, expensive cars, and a romantic marriage proposal. Lately, she had started meeting men online, going on dates almost every evening, but none of them seemed right for her. Just that day, she had gone out with a miser who took her to a cheap diner, prompting her to leave as soon as she realized there was no hope for anything better. Just 2 days ago, she had met with a wealthy and generous man. By the end of the evening, though, he concluded that they weren't compatible. Can you believe it? He dragged me to a Chinese porcelain exhibition. We walked around looking at vases and plates while he talked about emperors from the dinosaur era and other nonsense. Boring. Then he took her to some art house cinema. Why am I so unlucky with men? Don't worry, you'll find someone else, Sarah said uncertainly. Emily sighed and retreated to her room, dreading the next day at college. The professor looked at her with hostility, as if she were responsible for his own unattractiveness, weight, and loneliness. "You have serious problems with your academic performance," he said, his tone harsh. "Very serious." Emily put on her best innocent expression and nodded frequently, trying to confirm her sincerity. "I'm trying my best," she insisted. "I don't see that you're trying. You're skipping lectures. You probably have more important things to do than studying." He struggled to his feet and approached her closely, his eyes drifting over her face and settling lower on her blouse. "Maybe we can come up with something," Emily exhaled, feeling anxious about what to do. The thought of expulsion terrified her. Studying seemed to be her only chance of making it in the city, especially since she had no idea how to explain her situation to her parents. Summer was approaching, and she was supposed to return to the village and talk about her academic achievements, but she had none. "You could start attending lectures," the professor suggested with a shrug. "But I'm afraid in your case, it might already be pointless. I'll have to bring up the issue of your expulsion. Can't we come to some kind of agreement?" Emily asked flirtatiously, leaning forward slightly to show off her cleavage. She was aware of her beauty, tall, modern, and just bold enough. For a while now, she had suspected that the older professor had an interest in her, and judging by his reaction, she was right. "May I invite you somewhere?" he asked, his face turning red. "I'd love that and trust your taste completely," Emily replied, offering him an encouraging smile. That was enough to make him light up. He bowed his head, revealing a shiny bald spot surrounded by red hair, and kissed her hand. Neither Emily nor the professor realized that two students were eavesdropping outside the door. As soon as Emily left the classroom, they quickly moved away and headed straight to the rector's office, where they spoke with the vice-rector, who happened to be the professor's wife. Later that evening, Emily and the professor went to a restaurant and then to his house. He was sure his wife wouldn't be home for at least another 3 hours. But unexpectedly, the bedroom door swung open, and his wife appeared, leading to a scandal filled with shouting and tears. The professor, looking bewildered, rushed around the room, picking up his clothes. Emily sat on the big bed, watching the chaos unfold in horror. The wife glared at her husband with a mix of hatred and pity. "We've been together for 30 years. Our children are grown, and you already have 2 grandchildren. You still choose to cheat on me," she said bitterly. "Do I need to remind you of everything you owe to me?" She waved her hand in despair and shot an angry look at Emily. "And you're expelled." The verdict was announced 2 weeks later. Emily had been shaking on an old bus for 2 hours now, while a lively elderly woman had been filling the air with village gossip. Emily looked out the window, regretting her decision to spend the summer at her friend's country house. It felt impossible to go home and face her parents, so she called them, lying that she had passed her exams successfully and decided to stay in the city for the holidays. Now on the bus, She questioned whether she had made the right choice, but what other options did she have? Renting an apartment in the city was expensive, and the house in the village was free. The bus turned off the road and came to a stop. An elderly lady pulled some baskets into the aisle, then turned to Emily and said, "My relative David should be here to meet you. You're new here, so we can give you a ride." Emily got off the bus, took out her stylish suitcase, and looked around. People began to disperse in various directions, and the elderly woman hurried toward an old pickup truck. Emily found David quite appealing. Around 40 years old, tall, with neatly styled light hair and captivating gray eyes. "So, Annie, did you get to see your grandchildren?" he asked while opening the trunk. "Absolutely," she replied with a playful tone. "I had a lovely time with my grandchildren and explored the city." "That sounds nice," David said, nodding in approval as he cast a glance at the attractive stranger with chestnut curls and bright green eyes. "Hi there. Who are you planning to visit in this remote place?" "I came to your area to unwind," Emily answered thoughtfully. "Well, you won't find much here," David chuckled, his laughter contagious, causing Emily to smile. "I'm perfectly content with the river and the fresh air. The nature around here is stunning." When David learned that Emily would be staying in the old Smith house, he was surprised. "That place has been uninhabitable for ages," he remarked. Emily shrugged, feeling uncertain. "I'll manage somehow," she replied. "I was told there are tools in the barn." Shaking his head, David loaded her suitcase into the trunk and opened the back door. "Hop in. We'll figure out the house together." Meanwhile, Megan was busy in her own world, kneading dough while glancing at her children, who were deeply focused on building something with Legos. Although Megan had never been able to have children of her own, she adored the kids as if they were hers. She and her husband had adopted a boy and a girl from an orphanage when they were 5 and 3 years old. Before adoption, they had tried everything to conceive, from visiting doctors to seeking out shamans and psychics, but nothing worked. They nearly lost hope and even contemplated divorce, with Megan suggesting that her husband leave her to pursue a family elsewhere. He wanted children but chose to stay, reasoning that if it wasn't meant to be, they would remain together regardless. Then, the idea of adoption came to light. Megan had baked a pie and meticulously cleaned the house, determined to create a warm home. Despite her upbringing as a city girl from a wealthy family, she took great pride in her household. After moving to the countryside 3 years prior, Megan had fully embraced rural life, learning to bake, milk goats, and care for chickens. All essential skills for village living. Suddenly, the family dog barked joyfully. David had finally returned. Moments later, her husband entered, hung up his jacket, and examined his reflection in the mirror. Megan raised an eyebrow, surprised by his newfound interest in his appearance. "You're a bit late," she pointed out, glancing at the clock. "It's already 7:30. "A girl from the city just arrived," David shrugged. "William Smith's granddaughter rented the house for the summer. I gave her and my aunt a ride from the bus stop and helped her out a bit." He said this without making eye contact with Megan. "No one's lived in that house for quite some time. Even the windows are boarded up." "She came alone, right?" Megan asked, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, she's a student," David replied indifferently. "That's odd," Megan mused. "Well, let's eat. Have a seat." David quickly washed his hands and joined her at the table, taking a deep breath to savor the scent of freshly baked cabbage pie. "You're such an amazing hostess," he said, pulling Megan into a warm embrace. The next day, David returned to lend Emily a hand again. He fixed the table and stool and even hung a hammock in the yard. "I really appreciate your help," Emily said playfully. "Us villagers are simple folk. Just saying thank you is enough," David replied with a smile. "But you don't seem like a villager yourself," Emily remarked. David chuckled as he settled onto the repaired stool. "You're right. I moved here from the city with my wife and kids." Emily did her best to mask her disappointment at the revelation of David's marriage. "I'd love to hear how you ended up here," she said, feigning interest. David shrugged. "I used to visit my grandmother every summer. One time, an expensive car pulled up to our neighbor's house, and a woman, a man, and a little girl got out. They entered the house, and then some local boys approached me, saying, "Hey, this is our street. Get lost." I grabbed a stone and warned them that if they didn't leave me alone, they'd regret it. I threw the stone to scare them, but instead, I shattered the car window. The boys took off running, and I was left standing there in shock. Then, the door opened, and the same girl emerged. She looked at the car and asked, "Did you break it?" I nodded, feeling a mix of pride and embarrassment. Her father stepped outside, took one look at me and the broken car, and started yelling. But the girl calmly told him she had accidentally broken it, explaining that a big dog had frightened her, causing her to throw the stone. Her father softened, patted her head, apologized to me, and returned inside. I began to court that girl, leaving wildflowers at her gate every day. Once I even caught a fish in the river and placed it on their doorstep. I recall her father tossing the fish away and scolding her. What kind of joke is this in the village? I then decided to write her a love letter and slipped it into their mailbox. Her mother found it but didn't tear it up. She handed it over to her daughter. "How romantic!" Emily exclaimed, clapping her hands. And what happened next? Then I started getting poor grades in school and didn't return to the village anymore. I stayed home to study during the summer. Later, I went back to my grandmother's house, but the girl was gone. Years passed, and I joined the army. During my second year of service, I received a letter from my mother informing me of my grandmother's passing. At the funeral, a beautiful girl approached me. I looked at her and realized it was the same girl, now even more stunning. In short, I fell in love all over again, but this time it was serious. With just one day left before I returned to the army, I spent it with her. We talked, sat by the river, reminisced about our childhood, the fish, the broken car, and my love letter. She promised to wait for me until I completed my service. And did she? Emily gasped in surprise. "So, you finished your service, got married, and adopted children?" "Wow," she exclaimed. "You're a saint." David smiled modestly. "Oh, come on. I just always wanted kids." He hesitated, glancing away. Emily nodded, understanding. "That's personal. I get it." David felt a strange mix of shame and awkwardness wash over him. He was embarrassed that he had unintentionally compared this charming guest to his wife, and even more awkward because the comparison didn't favor his spouse. Later that evening, Emily sat in her bedroom, lost in thought. The fact that the handsome David was married with children was disheartening. As she slipped into her pajamas, she noticed a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. "Who's there?" "Show yourself," she called out. There were rustling sounds followed by silence, and an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. 10 minutes later, Emily was attempting to fix a hole in the fence when David caught sight of her. "What are you up to?" he asked, surprised. "I'm repairing the fence," Emily replied a bit irritably. "Can you help?" David stepped into the yard, agreeing to lend a hand. As Emily quickly explained what had happened, David chuckled good-naturedly. "Your neighbor, old Tom, hasn't cared about anything for ages. He's not a threat," he reassured her. Emily insisted she had heard someone moving around. David approached the fence, leaned into the gap, and gestured for Emily to come closer. "See that? That's what was making the noise," he said, pointing to a dog. Emily laughed, realizing her mistake. Grateful for David's help, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. In just 5 minutes, David was hammering away, fastening pine slats over the largest gaps. As he worked, he could feel Emily's gaze on his back, and he found himself comparing her to his wife once more, again finding her more appealing. Meanwhile, David's friend Oliver was searching for him. "Where is David?" Oliver asked, entering the house where Megan was busy knitting. "Where else would he be?" Megan replied, surprised. "Don't you work together?" Oliver scratched his balding head, looking puzzled. "He's not around. I've been searching for him all day. I need his signature to get the parts, but I can't reach him." Oliver said his goodbyes and hopped on his motorcycle, cruising down the street while scanning for the familiar blue pickup. Soon, He spotted it parked at the gate of the old, seemingly abandoned house, though it no longer looked deserted. The windows were open, women's clothes flapped on the line, and the door stood ajar. Oliver dismounted his motorcycle and knocked on the door. Inside, he heard voices and hurried footsteps. David opened the door, looking disheveled, shirtless, and with his belt undone. Everything was clear without the need for words. Though Oliver was David's friend, as a devoted family man, he couldn't condone such behavior. "I need to sign some papers," Oliver said, flustered. "I'm getting parts. I've been searching for you everywhere in the workshop. Do you have the papers?" David asked irritably. Oliver pulled a folder from his backpack and handed it over. Without even glancing at it, David signed the documents with a flourish. "What are you doing here?" Oliver inquired. "None of your business," David replied, fixing a stern gaze on him. "You didn't see anything, understand?" Oliver nodded uncertainly. David squeezed his hand tightly, looking intently into his eyes. "Just don't ask questions, okay? I haven't figured this out yet." Oliver had no intention of prying. He felt sorry for Megan and her 2 young children, and that disappointment hurt the most. Days passed, and David's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He came home late, ate quickly in silence, and answered Megan's questions with one-word replies or standard phrases. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong and began imagining the worst scenarios. She wanted to believe in him, but the situation only seemed to deteriorate. Megan didn't even notice when Rachel, Daniel's wife, and her friend entered the house. Rachel worked at the library and considered herself part of the village's intellectual elite. "Hi," she cheerfully greeted Megan. "You look like you're heading to a conference. What's on your mind?" "Trust," Megan replied. "Do you think if a man loves, he'll cheat?" Megan answered with a question of her own. Love is often romanticized in books, but even love doesn't prevent deceit. People lie. Those who are honest with some can be calculating and cunning with others. It's a paradox, my friend. Some deceive under pressure. Others lie for ego boosts. Some can't imagine existing without lies at all. But if you can't trust anyone, you live in constant stress, always searching for hidden meanings. You exhaust yourself and others with doubt. You can't truly love someone if you don't trust them. So why even bother starting a relationship? Rachel's musings only added to Megan's confusion. Perhaps she needed to simply talk to her husband heart to heart and see what happened next. However, the conversation never took place. Megan discovered her husband's infidelity by witnessing it firsthand. After chatting a little longer with her friend, she saw her off and, glancing at the clock, dialed David's number once again. He was unavailable. Without thinking twice, she left the house and walked down the street. As she strolled, people passed by, some from the farm, others from the sawmill or machine shop. Megan spotted Daniel. "Hi, do you know where David is?" she asked him. "How would I know?" Daniel replied, looking nervous as he averted his gaze. "Am I his babysitter?" "Don't act so coy," Megan pressed. "I can tell you're hiding something." "I'm tired. I'm going home," Daniel said, quickly turning away as he hurried down the street. Megan watched him for a moment before heading toward the river where the Smith house stood. As she approached, she spotted her husband's car under the dimming twilight and noticed the light flickering in the house, her hopes dwindling. Peering through the windows, she saw David locked in an embrace with a nearly naked young woman. A feeling of suffocation gripped Megan, but she managed to gather herself, opened the door, and stepped inside. David froze at the sight of her, and Megan shot him a disdainful look before storming out. She hurried down the street, desperately trying to hold back her tears. "Megan, wait," she heard David call from behind her as the sound of an engine revved up. "Listen." He leaned out of the car window, looking disheveled and fearful. "Wait, let me explain." Megan stopped, turned to him, and crossed her arms defiantly. "Explain," she challenged, narrowing her eyes. "Go ahead, try." "I don't even know how it happened," he stammered. "I lost my mind. I made a mistake." It happens. Please forgive me, Megan. Anger bubbled up inside her. She nearly lashed out. If it weren't for the passersby throwing curious glances their way, she might have. Let's talk at home, she said curtly, resuming her walk down the road. David slowly followed her. Get in the car, he urged. This looks strange. I'm driving while you walk? What will people think? Is that all you care about? Megan replied bitterly. They continued homeward in silence, she on foot and he in the car. Once inside, Megan sank onto the sofa, allowing quiet tears to flow. She didn't hurl objects or smash dishes. Her silent sorrow frightened David more than any outburst could. Let's just forget this happened, he pleaded. Do you want me to go to her right now and tell her there's nothing between us? Is that what you want? Because I love only you. Yes, I want that, Megan sobbed. I want you to pack your things and leave. I don't care where you go, with her or anyone else. I won't pack anything, he retorted, frowning. Then I'll help you, Megan replied, resolute. She opened the closet, and within 5 minutes, David's suitcase was filled with his clothes. Take your things and go, she said firmly. David exited the house, head hung low. He drove to the end of the street, stopped at Daniel's house, and honked. Daniel appeared almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. He glanced at the suitcase in the back seat and sighed sympathetically. She kicked you out? David nodded, pulling out a pack of cigarettes and offering one to Daniel. They smoked in silence. Well, I was thinking, David finally broke the quiet. Starting tomorrow, I'm going on vacation. I'm taking Emily to the sea. She's never been before, and I need a break. Get a grip, Daniel protested. Your family is falling apart, and you're planning a getaway with your mistress? What's wrong with you? It's none of your business. Just keep an eye on things here while I'm away, David shot back, tossing his cigarette aside and starting the car. He drove off toward Emily, leaving Daniel shaking his head in disbelief. The following day, David whisked his mistress away to the sea while his loyal wife stayed home with their 2 children. 10 days later, in the village, Daniel greeted his brother with enthusiasm. Hey bro, he slapped Thomas on the back. How long has it been? A couple of years, right? Thomas smiled back. Daniel admired his cousin's shiny new car. Nice ride, he exclaimed, running his hand over the sleek black BMW. Thanks, Thomas replied modestly. Business is going well, so I can afford it. Good for you, Daniel said, gesturing to his aging Ford. I'm still driving this old thing. It's not bad, Thomas remarked, giving the worn handles an affectionate pat. Rachel, Daniel's wife, chimed in. Oh, men will always be men, ready to talk about cars. Thomas, come in. We can't promise museums and restaurants, but we guarantee good fishing and a warm welcome. The men entered the house obediently, while Rachel quickly set the table out of courtesy. She spent half an hour with them before heading to her friend's house to discuss her husband's brother, whom she regarded as quite a worthy man. At Megan's house, Rachel animatedly shared everything she had learned about him with Megan. He's a good person, but unlucky in his personal life, she concluded. Unlucky, Megan replied, her tone indifferent. Despite Rachel's efforts, the prospect of a new suitor failed to impress her. She listened with half-hearted interest, her thoughts elsewhere as Rachel recounted tales of his past relationships. I really feel for him, Megan said. Though with his money, he could have anyone he wants. You can't buy love, Rachel sighed. That's true, Rachel agreed, echoing Megan's sentiment. Do you want to meet him? Megan burst out laughing. What's so funny? Rachel asked, confused. Even if I wanted to, how could I compete with the city beauties? Besides, I have 2 kids. But he said he always dreamed of a normal family. Yet he fell for that Helen, who turned out to be a real piece of work. She left her own child with her mother and went to the capital to chase her dreams. Yeah, it's a shame, Megan said, genuinely sympathetic. Over the past few days, Megan had transformed significantly, as though years had passed. While she still looked attractive, the spark of enthusiasm for life had dimmed in her eyes. She kept the house tidy, ensured the children were well-groomed and fed, and managed to take care of herself too. She hadn't let herself go or gained any weight, and she avoided sweets out of frustration. She recognized her responsibility to her two young children, who were innocent victims of their father's betrayal. Initially, Megan waited for David to return, even considering forgiveness if he promised to cut ties with his mistress. But as days turned into weeks, it became clear he was off enjoying the seaside with her. Megan brushed aside persistent invitations from friends, insisting, "I'm just not in the mood for new acquaintances right now." Meanwhile, Thomas and Daniel rode a motorcycle through the streets, laughing loudly. Villagers looked at them with either amusement or disapproval. "Thomas, where are you going?" Daniel yelled, pointing ahead. Thomas turned the handlebars, but it was too late. The front wheels sank into a muddy puddle. The motorcycle tipped, sending both of them crashing down. "Where did you learn to ride?" Daniel shouted. "It's my first time," Thomas protested. "What's going on here?" a stern voice asked. The men turned to find Rachel standing with her hands on her hips, glaring at them. "Darling, don't be mad. We were just taking a little ride," Daniel said, trying to defuse the situation. "I can see you're drunk," Rachel retorted. "Just a little," Daniel replied sheepishly, while Thomas remained silent, avoiding eye contact. Instead, he focused on the graceful woman standing behind Rachel, her tired brown eyes revealing a deeper story. Rachel turned to her and said reproachfully, "This is Megan. Thomas, this is my husband's brother, and apparently, he's an alcoholic too." "Hello," Thomas said, brushing dirt off his expensive jeans. "Excuse us for the noise. I haven't seen my brother in ages." Megan offered a sad smile and took out a handkerchief, pressing it to his forehead. "Oh, you're hurt. Come inside. I'll treat your wound." Daniel chimed in, showing his scraped elbow. "I'm hurt too. I need treatment too." "I'll make sure you remember it for life," Rachel teased, pretending to be angry. "Come on, get your bike and let's head home," she promised her husband. Thomas and Megan watched as the motorcycle roared away up the street. "Megan, please open the gate." She retrieved gauze and peroxide, quickly treating his scrape while Thomas observed her silently, seemingly in admiration. "You have such soft hands," he remarked. Megan felt herself blush. Rachel was right. This Thomas was undeniably attractive, and there was a certain sadness in his eyes. "It just happens," she replied nonchalantly as she finished applying a Band-Aid. "All done." He touched the thick bandage on his forehead. "Do you live alone with your children?" "I'm at a friend's house right now." "And your husband?" "I don't have a husband." She paused. "I don't have a husband anymore." "Did you get divorced?" Megan locked eyes with him, her gaze intense. "Thomas, it's time for you to go. I have a lot to do." Thomas nodded, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry for the intrusive questions. I was just curious. Thank you for treating my wound." Later that evening, Thomas asked Daniel for more information about Megan. "So, David went to the sea with his mistress," Daniel explained. Thomas shook his head. "Oh, and I asked her about her husband." "What a fool I am," he said regretfully. "Don't worry. You didn't know," his cousin reassured him. "So, did you like her?" Thomas nodded. "Listen, though, there's one important thing," Daniel said reluctantly. "She has 2 adopted children." "I don't see that as a problem. In fact, that's wonderful," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "It's another plus for her. If she has adopted kids, it shows she has a kind heart." Daniel glanced at Rachel, who smiled faintly at his side. The next morning, Thomas woke up early and drove to the nearest town. He bought a stunning bouquet of red roses, Belgian chocolates, and a bottle of French champagne. An hour later, Thomas stood at Megan's door, politely knocking. 2 children emerged from the house, staring at the guest with curiosity. "Who are you?" one of them asked. "Me." Thomas winked, handing them the box of candies. "I'm here for your mother. Is she home?" The children eagerly grabbed the box and dashed inside. Moments later, Megan appeared in the doorway. Seeing the guest, she instinctively adjusted her hair and pulled down her long skirt. "Hello, Megan. Thomas said with a polite nod. I hope you're not too busy. Are you here for something? She asked. What do you want? Thomas shrugged. I'm just here for you. Meanwhile, David quickly sensed that something was off with his new girlfriend. As soon as they settled into the hotel, Emily, who had seemed so carefree, transformed into an unbearable shrew right before his eyes. She acted as if everyone owed her something. She grumbled to the staff about not having a room with a sea view, even though David had booked a standard room. Demonstratively pulling the curtains, she constantly nagged him about how he could have found better vacation arrangements. Then, she complained about the noise she claimed was coming from a broken air conditioner. She wandered to the neighboring rooms to check how loud it was for them. Other guests complained about her rudeness, and the staff asked her to stop. Instead of relaxing, she decided to fight every perceived slight, screaming at the maids and contemptuously calling the beach a dirty dump and the sea a stinky puddle. To top it off, she ended up getting sick from something at the hotel restaurant, spending 2 days in the bathroom. When David suggested she see a doctor, she disdainfully replied that she trusted local doctors even less than local chefs. Watching her behavior, David felt like he was losing his mind. For this woman, he had given up Megan. It was already clear that this would be their first and last vacation together. Tired of being embarrassed by her, he finally set a condition. Either she calms down and appreciates what they have, or he would leave. Emily took offense and stormed out of the hotel. David searched for her throughout the city all night, eventually finding her drunk at a roadside cafe with a group of rowdy men. When he insisted she come back to the hotel with him, she brazenly smiled and told him to go away. As their conversation escalated, her companions stepped in. Defeated, David returned to the hotel alone, gathered his things, and went to the airport, feeling miserable. He regretted meeting Emily and cursed her for her frivolity and himself for being weak. Now his sole focus was on begging for forgiveness from his wife. He had no doubt he would succeed. After landing, David left the airport and took his truck from the parking lot, driving home through a small town. Passing through, he realized it might be easier to ask for forgiveness with gifts, but he was so angry at Emily that he didn't even think to get anything for his wife and kids. So, he stopped at the first store he found and bought the most expensive champagne and a lavish box of chocolates. The cashier looked surprised as she placed the items in front of him. Strange. You're the second person buying this today, she remarked. Who was the first? David asked. I don't know. A handsome man in a black BMW with out-of-state plates, she replied. As he drove up to his house, he noticed the black BMW parked out front. He got out of his truck and stared at the sleek vehicle, muttering to himself. Holding the champagne and chocolates tightly, he pushed open the gate and entered the yard. As soon as he stepped inside, he heard his wife's laughter mingling with that of an unfamiliar man. Confused, he stood there for a moment before walking into the house. In the kitchen, he found a guest sitting at the table, sipping tea across from Megan. As soon as they saw him, their smiles faded. What am I supposed to make of this? He growled, locking eyes with his wife as he took a seat, asserting his presence in the house. I don't owe you any explanations, she replied, her tone calm. Do you think you can ask me such questions after everything you've done? David had no retort to that, so he scowled and glared at the guest. Thomas remained unfazed. Who are you, and what are you doing here? David snapped. Do you even know she's my wife? I've never seen you before, Thomas said, mockingly. How would I know? The tension in the room thickened. Megan stood up, placing herself between the two men. You see, very soon I won't be your wife anymore, she said coolly, addressing David. We're getting a divorce, and I trust you won't object. I object, he shouted, his voice rising as he hurled the champagne and chocolates to the floor. Megan narrowed her eyes at him. Was it me who took a mistress and ran off to the seaside? And you're glad that I did? David retorted, his anger flaring. Now I am, Megan shot back, her voice filled with delight. And it would be best if you just left. Thomas felt awkward, not because he feared David's return, but because he felt uncomfortable witnessing the family drama unfold. Scene. David, can I talk to you? He said. Let's go outside and talk like men. David responded with a stream of curses that forced Megan to push him out of the house. Still fuming, he sat in the car and drove away. Thomas looked at Megan seriously. Are you really serious about divorcing him? Absolutely, she replied quietly, looking at him in surprise. I'm glad, Thomas said, taking her hand, which smelled of lavender soap, and kissing it. She felt embarrassed and quickly pulled her hand away. Thomas, you've only known me for a short time. I've met many women before and always thought I was in love. But then I saw you and realized I was mistaken, confusing infatuation with genuine feelings. He continued, now that I've met you, I know I love you. Later, after he left, Megan washed the dishes with a smile, recalling her childhood summers spent in the village with her parents. She remembered how she used to secretly watch a boy who would leave flowers under her gate before running away without a backward glance. She thought of the letter in which the boy confessed his love to her. Turning off the water, she quickly dried her hands and headed to her bedroom. Digging through her old belongings, she pulled out a yellowed envelope and read the nearly forgotten lines. Pressing the letter to her chest, she burst into tears. Honestly, she still missed David, but his betrayal pushed her to forget him. Such actions were unforgivable. And with Thomas, it felt as if his feelings were genuine. Sometimes love happens at first sight. As for her feelings, only time would tell. 3 months later, a typical family strolled along the main street of the capital. A father, mother, and 2 children. The kids gazed around in wonder, as if the world around them were a fairy tale. Thomas and Megan smiled as they observed the scene in comfortable silence. It wasn't that they had nothing to say. They simply enjoyed walking side by side without words. How about trying the status of a married woman again? Thomas finally broke the silence. I haven't fully recovered from the divorce yet, Megan replied with a smile. I still hear his curses ringing in my ears. David wasn't going to give up easily. He returned time and again, begging, pleading, threatening, and even trying to blackmail her with the children. The more he returned, the more annoyed she became. She saw neither pride nor remorse in his actions. By then, Thomas had gone back to his city, but regularly called Megan before coming back to the village for a serious discussion with David. No, he didn't threaten him. He simply offered a substantial sum of money. At first, David was offended. Then he pondered it over and grew even bolder, demanding that they give him the house in exchange for agreeing to the divorce. Thomas suggested to Megan that they move into his large apartment in the city and let David keep the house. She agreed, especially since there was nothing left for her in the village. After the deal was finalized, David and Megan quickly divorced. She had no idea what happened to his mistress. David simply claimed they had broken up. One day, Mrs. Smith, the owner of the house where Emily had been staying, visited Megan and revealed that Emily had returned to her hometown and found work at a poultry farm. None of her grand plans had materialized. No marriage, no education, no money. Now, Megan was coming to terms with the fact that she had been living with a mercenary man who was not only unfaithful, but also cruel. She wanted to hear nothing more about him, and for the first time in a long while, she was grateful that the children had been adopted. Forget about him. You left the house. Let him live how he wants, and you're here with me and the kids, too, Thomas said. She nodded and smiled, and suddenly the autumn sky shifted from gloomy and unfriendly. The sun peeked out from behind leaden clouds, reflecting off the wet cobblestones and sparkling in the windows, casting golden flashes that danced across the buildings and illuminated the square. In that moment, Megan felt a burst of brightness and happiness. The clouds in her soul dissipated, making way for the long-awaited sun.